consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Madam President, today America lays to rest the great Justice John Paul Stevens. On behalf of the United States Senate, it is my privilege, along with my Illinois colleague, Senator Tammy Duckworth, to introduce and have adopted a bipartisan resolution honoring this remarkable, noble man and native of the city of Chicago. During his Supreme Court confirmation hearing in 1975, then Judge John Paul Stevens faced a line of questioning about his health, which in retrospect is amusing. His health? They were asking questions about it 44 years ago. Justice Stevens had undergone single bypass heart surgery 2 years earlier, and the members of the Judiciary Committee just wanted to make sure that he could handle the rigors of serving on the United States Supreme Court. History has shown us that Justice John Paul Stevens had not only a strong heart, but a good heart when it came to serving on the United States Supreme Court. Sadly, that mighty heart finally did stop beating last week. Justice Stevens was 99 years old. He died peacefully with his daughters Elizabeth and Susan by his side. My state of Illinois is proud to claim John Paul Stevens as a native son. He was a member of a prominent Chicago family, and he grew up in the luxury of his family's hotel, then known as the Stevens Hotel, now known as the Hilton Hotel on Michigan Avenue. He never used the privilege of his family's wealth to shirk his responsibilities as a citizen of America. In World War II, he was a lieutenant commander in the Navy, was awarded the Bronze Star for his service on the code-breaking team whose work led to the downing of the plane of the man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the war, he became an accomplished attorney and a champion of good, ethical government. It was John Paul Stevens' integrity, as much as his brilliant legal mind, that convinced President Gerald Ford to nominate him, then a federal judge on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, to serve on the United States Supreme Court in 1975. President Ford called then Judge Stevens, quote, "the finest legal mind I can find," end of quote. The Senate obviously agreed. The vote on the Senate floor for John Paul Stevens' confirmation was 98-0. He was the second oldest and third longest serving justice in the history of our nation. But it is the quality of his service and not its length that most distinguishes John Paul Stevens' career in the United States Supreme Court. Justice Stevens approached disputes fairly, squarely, and succinctly. He took great pains to understand all sides of a case and give all sides a fair hearing. He rejected the easy path of ideology, and he was willing to change his position when the facts warranted. He authored the majority opinions in some of the most famous and important Supreme Court decisions in his time. One example, in 2004, Justice Stevens wrote the majority opinion in which the court, by a vote of 6-3, rejected the Bush administration's view that prisoners at Guantanamo Bay could be held beyond the reach of the law with no access to the federal courts. The case Rasul versus Bush. And in 1984, in the landmark Chevron case, Justice Stevens wrote an opinion for a unanimous Supreme Court about the deference owed to agency interpretations of federal statutes, crafting a legal framework that has been cited in more than 11,000 subsequent judicial opinions. He was also often brilliant in dissent. In his lengthy dissent in Citizens United versus the FEC in 2010, Justice Stevens rejected the radical, and I believe personally, dangerous notion that corporations have essentially the same First Amendment rights as individuals and should be allowed to spend potentially unlimited amounts of money on campaigns. President Eisenhower famously said that he made only 2 mistakes as president, quote, and they're both sitting on the Supreme Court, end of quote. President Ford felt just the opposite about his choice in Justice Stevens. In 2005, a year before his death, President Ford wrote of Justice Stevens, and I quote, "I'm prepared to allow history's judgment of my term in office to rest, if necessary, exclusively on my nomination 30 years ago of John Paul Stevens to the U.S. Supreme Court." End of quote. I can think of no higher praise. Justice Stevens stepped down from the Supreme Court 9 years ago. Anyone who had hoped that he might slip quietly into retirement was certainly disappointed. He continued in his retirement to speak and write forcefully and eloquently on major issues facing America. In 2014, he testified before the Senate Rules Committee on the dangers that dark money in politics pose to the American democracy. He wrote 3 books. Justice Stevens once told an interviewer that the person who most motivated him to write was a professor from whom he took a poetry class at the University of Chicago. The professor's name was Norman Maclean. In his own retirement, Norman Maclean wrote a semi-autobiographical novel entitled A River Runs Through It and Other Stories. It was later made into a movie starring Robert Redford. Looking at the life's work of John Paul Stevens, it's clear that a river ran through his life too. The currents in that river included a reverence for the American democracy and Constitution, compassion and respect for individuals, and a painstaking commitment to decide each case on its merits rather than relying on easy answers suggested by political ideology. Justice John Paul Stevens was a good man, a courageous man, whose strong heart was matched by a brilliant mind, ceaseless curiosity, and a fierce commitment to justice. He fought the good fight. He served our nation with honor, and he safeguarded and enriched our democracy. May he rest in peace and honor. Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-Res 282 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 282, honoring former Associate Justice John Paul Stevens of the Supreme Court of the United States.
I further ask the resolution be agreed to.
Without objection.
Thank you.
The Senate will proceed to the measure.
Thank you.